We're going to talk about making some adjustments in Lightroom in the Develop module. Specifically, we're going to talk about bracketing our exposures and adjusting those brackets to see what the tolerance is for over and underexposed. But before we get to that, I want to give you just a little bit more detail to kind of help you understand what's being displayed and how the image is sort of put together. So we're going to start off by talking about primary colors, and there's two different sets of primary colors that we're going to talk about. One of them is the subtractive primaries, and that is ink on paper. So if we were to print out our photos with an inkjet printer, we would end up utilizing the subtractive primary colors. And those primary colors are cyan, magenta, and yellow. And when we combine those all together, we get black. So if you have an inkjet printer, you probably recognize this cyan, magenta, yellow, and black as your ink cartridges. That's the CMYK, K being black, or all three colors together. And the reason we have a black ink cartridge is so we don't use up all our cyan, magenta, and yellow ink, because it's just the combination of the three. If we combine two of the colors together, we get our secondary colors. So cyan and magenta give you blue, cyan and yellow get you green, magenta and yellow get you red. And you can see that the opposite of cyan would be red, and the opposite of yellow would be blue, and the opposite of magenta would be green. And that red, green, and blue gives us our additive primary colors. And when we talk about additive primary colors, we're talking about projected light. So that would be your monitor, that would be a light bulb, would be projecting out a color of light. And so those are red, green, and blue. And if we combine all three of those together, we get white. So the pureness of the additive color primaries is white. The pureness of the subtractive primaries is black. If we combine red and green together, we get yellow. If we combine red and blue together, we get magenta. If we combine blue and green together, we get cyan. And you can see that they all match their opposites the same way. Here is sort of the color wheel as a whole, and you can see that red and cyan are opposite, and blue and yellow are opposite, and green and magenta are opposite. So these colors all represent what we see and what we're dealing with in Lightroom. This entire horseshoe, the whole thing, all the colors are all the colors that we can perceive. But we work within a color space in our computer and in our software. And we've talked about making that color space Adobe RGB 1998. And you can see that that is a relatively large color space, not quite as large as all the colors we can perceive, but it is far larger than the sRGB color space, and even larger than the CMYK or printed color space. We'll go into more detail later in the class about color space, but right now I just wanted you to understand that what we're looking at is just a portion of visible or perceivable color. So the way that this happens is that our images actually have three channels in them: a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. And each of those channels is represented by a grayscale image. That grayscale image for each channel being the white pixels in it are the pureness of that color, and the black pixels are the lack of that color. And when we combine those three things together, those three channels together, we end up with our full color image. Because as the red, green, and blue combine, they create cyan, magenta, and yellow in varying amounts and varying tones and varying brightnesses. And that gives us all of our colors, our entire color space. This is what it looks like when we kind of break it down with our histogram, right? So we have our full color image at the top with our histogram, the distribution of pixels from black to white, left to right. And as we look at each channel, we can see that the things that are cyan come out black in the red channel because they're lacking in red, right? If we remove cyan, we're adding red. And if we add red, we're removing cyan. It kind of works as a balance that way. And you can kind of see that in the histograms, in the way that the histograms are laid out. And so this is sort of the balance of it. When we look at that histogram at the top, we can see that there's a fair amount, not a lot, but some things in this image that are pure black or very close to pure black, and there are not very many things in this image that are actually pure white because we don't have much histogram information on the right side of the histogram. And these are all working with the red, green, and blue, or the additive primary colors. So our histogram is sort of broken down into 5 sections. We have the blacks on the left, the shadows just to the right of that, the exposure in the center, the highlights to the right of exposure, and the whites on the far right extreme of this. There's 256 steps from 0 to 255. 256 steps from black to white, from pure black to pure white. And when I say pure black, if you were to print it on a printer, it would use all of the black ink that it could in order to make that print. And if you had pure white and you printed it on a printer, it would use no ink. It would be the pure whiteness of the paper that you're printing on. What we're going to talk about today is really going to be adjusting the exposure, the contrast, the highlights, and the shadows. Very little whites and blacks will be adjusted in our images today. And so here you can see our develop module settings that we can adjust. And just to sort of point it out real quick, there's that color section at the top with our color temperature, and you can see that it goes from blue to yellow, the opposite colors, and for the tint, from green to magenta, opposite colors as well. What we're going to deal with is exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. So you can adjust the sliders down below and move them from side to side, and it'll give you a numeric value of how much you have adjusted your exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. You can also click in the histogram, and a little double arrow will show up, and you can slide that back and forth, and that will not only adjust your histogram, but it'll also move the slider down below to show what you're adjusting and make those adjustments in your develop module. So in our lab demo this week, you will see I'll go in and I will convert my image to black and white, and then I'll make adjustments. I'll show you both using the histogram and the sliders down below in order to get the image to look the way I want it to look. When we take our photos, we're going to need to bracket. What we've talked about with our exposures up to now is sort of equivalent exposures, or getting that balance to be at the 0 mark on our exposure guide in our camera. And what we're going to do today is we're going to purposefully over and underexpose our images. So I'm going to show you in a quick little exposure simulator kind of what we're going to get out of that. So you can see that I'm set in manual exposure mode. I'm going to set my ISO to 100, and then I'm going to bring my balance back to the center of my exposure scale up here. And so I'm going to have to go down 1 stop on my shutter speed in order to get back to that balance. The arrow was at the +1 before, which meant that my exposure was 1 stop overexposed, but I want it to be normally exposed. And then I'm going to do my brackets, and I'm going to do 5 brackets. I'm going to go from 2 stops underexposed to 2 stops overexposed. And so what I need to do is purposefully unbalance my exposure. Right now our exposure is balanced. We're right in the center. I'm going to take it to 2 stops underexposed by increasing my shutter speed 2 stops to a 500th of a second. And you can see now that my image looks a little bit darker, well, actually significantly darker, and the arrow is now pointing to the -2, meaning it's 2 stops underexposed. So I would take an exposure, and then I would move to a 250th of a second. I'm now 1 stop underexposed. I would take another exposure, move back to my 125th, my normal, and take another exposure, go to a 60th, which is now 1 stop over, and we're getting a slightly brighter image, and take another exposure, go to a 30th of a second, which is 2 stops overexposed, significantly brighter, and take another exposure. Now we've also talked about how beyond a 60th of a second, you should really be stabilizing your camera in some way. So if you have a tripod, put your camera on a tripod for this assignment. It'll do 2 things for you. One, it'll make your compositions exactly the same from each exposure. And 2, it will stabilize your camera so that if you get into a slower shutter speed, you won't have to worry about camera movement. If you don't have a tripod and you're worried about a 1/30th of a second, I'll go back to the normal exposure. We're balanced again. I can increase my ISO 1 stop, which is now going to overexpose my image by 1 stop, and that will allow me to adjust my shutter speed to a 250th of a second. At a 250th of a second, 2 stops overexposed is only a 60th, and I should be able to handhold that. The other thing you can do, because remember, exposure is balanced stop for stop on each scale, is that we could overexpose at 1 stop with our f-stop or go to f5.6, and that would even make me, now with ISO 200 at 5.6, my camera wants to be at a 500th of a second to have the balanced exposure. And now my 2 stops over is only 1/125th of a second. My 2 stops under would be a 2,000th of a second. All of those are very hand-holdable. So when we do our assignment this week, this is what we want to do, is we want to find that balance. We want to find a normal exposure that is probably in the 250th to a 500th of a second range. And we'll have to balance our aperture and our ISO to get that, right? So if I wanted to be at f8, I'm now underexposed again, I could go to ISO 400. I would recommend not going above ISO 400. Try to keep your ISO as low as possible, but it should be, if you shoot these outside, very doable. F8 at about a 250th of a second, or 5.6 at a 250th at ISO 100 or 200. So find all of that balance. If you have a question about any of this, or if it doesn't make any sense, please message me and let me know. So once we do that, what we end up getting is our bracketed exposures. And here, this shows you a set of bracketed exposures from 2 stops under to 2 stops over, and what the histograms look like for all of those images. So there's my normal in the center, and you can see my histogram has a pretty decent distribution of the pixels from pure black to pure white. Very few pure white, and maybe a few pure black with the deep dark shadows. And you see as I go to -2 stops or 2 stops under, my histogram really pushes to the left, signifying that everything is much darker in my image. And as I get to 2 stops over, or +2 stops, my histogram really pushes to the right, signifying that everything is very bright in my image. So you need to be aware of these histograms as you're doing these brackets. And we'll look at them in Lightroom as well in our lab module and talk a little bit more about it. But you want to get used to looking at the histogram because it'll give you the true distribution of pixels. And then you can analyze your image and say, my image is overall sort of gray in this scene. And so I should have quite a few pixels towards the center of my image, which my normal histogram does kind of show. My image is probably slightly bright, probably because of the haze in the sky, and my pixels are all distributed a little bit to the right of center, which looks perfectly fine for what this image is. So when we do this assignment, we want to get these 5 brackets, and then we want to sort of analyze what these 5 brackets are, and then we're going to do some adjustments to see what we can get out of each of these images. So this is the basis for our black and white or bracketed exposure assignment.